Hi, I'm Justin, one of the pastors at High Rock, and I'm honored to share from God's Word with you today. I'm honored, but also hesitant because this encounter between Jesus and the religious leaders puts me at unease. Have you ever seen the show Kitchen Nightmares? It's one of these shows where someone needs help, they get the help, but then they don't want to do what the expert says. I remember this one episode where Gordon Ramsay rolls up and things go downhill fast. First, the restaurant sign isn't even for the right restaurant. It's an old one. That's a bad sign. Literally. And instead of guests ordering at the bar, they can help themselves to tequila dispenser. Nice for them, bad for the business. Despite this, only 2 tables are occupied in a place that seats 120. The menu is repurposed from another restaurant, basically with the same exact items. The kitchen was disgusting. The cockroaches were living their best life. It doesn't take a world-renowned chef like Ramsay to see that things are clearly a disaster here. And yet the manager, Vic, was struggling to understand why they were losing $15,000 per week. Per week! Who has that kind of money? He was the one with the actual responsibility of running the restaurant, and yet he was the only one who was totally missing what the problem was. Him. It's crazy how stubborn the restaurant manager was. It just left me wondering, how can someone possibly be like that? Actually, I might have more insight to the answer than I want to admit. I remember a time when I had a lot of toy cars. Now, I loved my toy cars. My dad traveled frequently for work, so he'd always take the time to buy one toy car as a present to bring back home. After a couple of years of his work travels, I racked up a whole bin of them. And one day, I invited my best friend Jong-hoon over for a play date. I was so excited. I could hardly wait. So he comes over, and we start playing with my Legos. It was all great until we moved on to my toy cars. Now here's what you need to know about me. My idea of playing with toy cars was perfectly lining them up in one line and looking at them. I know, pretty odd, right? So when Jong-un took out 2 cars to play, I flipped out. I lashed out at him shouting, "No, these are mine!" My mom heard from the other room and rushed over to find that I swiftly took the cars away from Jong-un. "Justin, why don't you try sharing so that you can play together?" "No, these are mine!" And just like that, because of my stubborn instance, Jong-un got upset and started to cry, which made me cry as well. And seeing that I was unwilling to budge, he barged out the door and went back home. Playtime nightmares. It's crazy, I know, and kind of sad. My mom was trying to help me, but I wouldn't listen to her. They are my toys. But I didn't acquire them on my own. They were gifts from my dad. He used his money, spent his time picking them out so that I could experience joy. His gift was for joy. My joy in receiving the gifts brought him joy too. But he also saw how those gifts could bring joy to other people too. And just like Vic at the restaurant, I had a responsibility to use my toys well. My parents wanted me to use them to make friendships, but my actions ended up breaking one. I thought the problem was Jong-un or my parents, but it was me. I wanted to do it my way because I insisted that it was my stuff. Mine, mine, mine. You probably have similar experiences. Thankfully, we all grow out of that stubborn, self-centered blindness when we get older, right? Well, I'm not so sure. Because our close friends and family can see areas of unhealth in our lives, and we might even agree with them that it's there, but in our stubbornness, we refuse to get help. It's my life and body after all. Experts tell us that our social media consumption causes undue anger and anxiety in us, yet we keep going back to them. We even set screen time and app time limits so that we can devote more time to family or formational practices, but we keep hitting remind me in 15 minutes until we're just too exhausted to devote that time elsewhere. It's my free time. Our spouses or our friends have lovingly warned us that we're spending too much time at work or on certain unhealthy relationships, yet we're so quick to say yes to that next request or invitation. It's my choice. Climate experts have revealed research data showing how our trash affects us and the living conditions of certain neighborhoods and future generations, yet we refuse to prioritize sustainability. As long as it doesn't affect me. We're currently in a sermon series exploring some of the warning signs Jesus left his followers so that we don't miss out on the full, better life that he invites us to consider. As we've seen in previous weeks, those warnings are hard to swallow. They were so challenging that large crowds that once followed Jesus started walking away. They loved the healings, they loved the free bed, and they loved the show. But they weren't nearly as interested when Jesus started pushing changes that impinged on their autonomy. Who is this Jesus to tell me how to live my life? So Jesus tells them a parable in which a landowner struck a deal with tenant farmers who agreed to give a share of what they grow as their rent. This landowner diligently provided everything they would need to run a successful vineyard. When harvest time came, the landowner sent one of his servants to collect his share of the crop. But instead of paying what they owed, the tenants decided to beat the servant and send him back empty-handed. What in the world? To not pay their agreed-upon percentage was one reason sufficient enough for eviction. I mean, if you're a renter, can you imagine refusing to pay this month's rent to your landlord? Yeah, probably not. But to go a step further and cause physical harm to the servant, I mean, where did they even get the idea that that's okay? As if that act wasn't egregious enough, they insulted, beat, and killed other servants until only one person was left, the landowner's son. Surely, after all that he had lost, you'd think that the landowner would have hired some hitmen to get rid of them. But no. He decided to send his own son, the one whom he loved dearly, to make one last plea. Now, most of us aren't farmers today. And if we're renters, we probably pay on time if at all possible, or ask for an extension if there is some emergency. But these farmers aren't short on cash at the end of the month. They have the money. They just decide that they're not going to pay. So surely, Jesus isn't really talking about us here. But if we think that, we're probably missing the point. Jesus wasn't talking about farms and paying rent, even back then. He was using their life experience to help them see a deeper principle. He was using something they saw every day to help them see a deeper truth about their relationship with God. And it's the same with us. You might not be kicking rent collectors to the curb or threatening the lives of your landlord's family. At least I hope you're not doing that. But our problem is just as bad, even if it's harder to see. Last February, I found out that my wife was pregnant with our first child. I was thrilled. And I was worried. I felt like I didn't have enough of a good grasp on my finances, so I started researching personal finance coaches on YouTube. In the beginning, I was excited to learn new things. But very soon, I was overtaken by anxiety at the realization that, gosh, I lack so much knowledge. So when our daughter was born, I felt even more anxious. In between the diapers and the feeds and the crazy sleep schedules, I'd go on YouTube and learn more and more and more. And at one point, I realized how unhappy I was. Here we are with our first adorable daughter, and I'm stressing out over our finances. I was so convinced that more knowledge would lead to better planning and a sense of freedom, but I just grew more and more obsessive. I never really struggled with money before. You see, I've experienced so much of God's tangible preventions in my life. My parents were also good models about not being anxious about money. I started tithing in first grade, but my relationship with money changed. I wasn't at peace. I was worried. God had always provided, but I wasn't so sure anymore. I thought, maybe God doesn't need my money, but I do. We could get a bigger place, or I could put that away for our daughter's education. It's my money after all. I acquired the skills and hustled to get there. I worked really hard for it. All of what's in my bank account, that's mine. It got to the point where I began nitpicking the Christmas gifts my wife was purchasing. Asked her who was getting what and why, and how much each gift costs, and if that person deserved such a gift. Because after all, it was my money. It's exactly how the farmers were thinking in Jesus' story. It's my crop. It's my money. I planted the seed. I took care of the land. I harvested the crops. I did. It's mine. Mine, mine, mine. The farmers heard that the landowner's son was on his way and plotted a plan to murder him so that they could once and for all take the estate for themselves. It's pretty clear that the tenant farmers thought that this land and all the fruit that it bore was theirs. Well, yes, but that's where you see the problem, in the fruits. We're told later that the religious leaders hearing this parable realized that Jesus was telling the story against them. They would have recognized the imagery of the vineyard, for the prophet Isaiah spoke of it describing God's beloved who had a vineyard, which was Israel. God's beloved waited for a harvest of sweet grapes, but the grapes that grew were bitter. God expected a crop of justice, but instead found oppression. God expected to find righteousness, but heard cries of violence. Jesus was pointing to the fact that Israel's leaders had done a bad job farming the vineyard. And God sent many prophets, and yet their reactions were to ignore, insult, beat, and kill them. And now they're ready to kill the vineyard's owner's own son, Jesus. They wanted what God could give them, land, peace, provision. But they neither wanted God nor God's instructions for those gifts. Friends, I wonder if that's our story too. I wonder if we focus so much on what we think is ours, what we believe are our prerogatives, our rights, that we forget that everything we have is a gift. We enter the world with nothing and we leave with nothing. What we own is just a gift from God. And God gives it to us so we have something we give to one another. But when we insist that it all belongs to us, man, we find ourselves siding with each other over things that don't matter. We hurt people who are everlasting just to hold on to stuff, which all turns to dust anyway. We lose friends because we want all our toys in a nice little line. And not just fighting with one another, but fighting with God for things that we can't keep and things that belong to God anyway. During my first semester in graduate school, I met a friend named Ethan. Ethan was incredibly gifted intellectually. He had the ability to understand complex theological and philosophical concepts better than anyone I knew. And he wanted to cultivate a type of spiritual community that would embrace all peoples and allow friends to wrestle with hard questions together without letting differences in opinions or life experiences divide us. He embodied that by first extending genuine friendship to me and our other first-year students. At the same time, Ethan lacked the self-awareness to sense the group's increasing discomfort with debates that felt more like fights. About a couple months into our friendship, some friends started to distance themselves from Ethan because of this. So a problem arose when I initiated a group hangout. When I floated the idea with a few in the group, they were reluctant to include Ethan. I understood their sentiment, but It was an easy choice for me because I had a unique relationship with Ethan. He confided in me more than he did with others. He shared with me confidentially that he actually felt lonely. He longed for life giving friendships where he would be truly embraced. So I had a choice: invite him and risk a pretty awkward, unpleasant outing, or just don't tell him. I mean, it was just one outing, right? He doesn't need to know. And to be honest, it'll be way better if he didn't come anyway. Well, that didn't turn out so well because we got busted as soon as we arrived back on campus. Noticing what had happened, Ethan went back to his room, hurt and dejected. He was gracious enough to forgive us soon after, but we lost his trust. That broken trust eventually led to Ethan drifting apart from our group and perpetuating his sense of loneliness and struggles with depression. Gosh, I so wish I could do that over again. I was too concerned with my own comfort that I failed to challenge him honestly about the effect he had on people. I was so convinced that I needed to do whatever I could to protect this group because it was mine. I invested in this group. I was seeing the fruits of my relational work. I wanted us to have a good time. I wanted this outing to further develop our friendships. But I also knew deep down that it was actually an opportunity to obey Jesus and extending love to someone who was hurting and longing to belong. But just like the religious leaders ignored God's commands, I chose to ignore Jesus' command to love my neighbor because I was disillusioned that this was my group, that somehow I was the one who built it. I was blind to the fact that God had gifted me with these friends at a stage of my life when I longed for Christian friendships and spiritual companionship. Instead of challenging myself and others to bless Ethan with the gift of community that we had received, instead of challenging Ethan to consider and change the ways he was alienating others, I just took the easy way out. Out of fear of rocking the boat, we had failed to offer him truth and accountability and ended up rejecting him and Jesus along the way. I felt entitled to my group. Or rather, I felt that I could use this group, a gift from God, to just meet my own needs, much like Israel's leaders had done with God's vineyard, Israel. They saw their gifts and position as something to be used for their own benefit, rather than seeing the gifts God had given them as opportunities to bless others. As long as they saw everything as theirs rather than God's, they felt justified in doing whatever they had to do to hold on to their stuff. But the landowner decided to give them one last chance. This time, he will send not a servant but his own son. If they're going to listen to anyone, surely they will have to listen to his son. How do they respond? Here comes the heir to this estate. Let's kill him and get the estate for ourselves. So they grabbed him and murdered him and threw his body out of the vineyard. There! They succeeded. They finally got what they thought it was rightfully theirs. What's sad is that they had an opportunity to choose reconciliation, but chose rebellion. And here's the part that makes me uncomfortable. Jesus asked, "What do you suppose the owner of the vineyard will do?" Perhaps we'd hope for the owner to give up his vineyard and just let them have it. Perhaps we want the owner to just forgive and forget. No. Jesus said that the owner will come and kill those farmers and lease the vineyard to others. Oof, that's a tough word. Maybe that makes you feel uncomfortable too. It feels like God is going out to get revenge on these farmers. But like some of the extreme language Jesus used in other warnings we've explored, we must consider Jesus' intent here. Remember those times when we got caught as kids doing something wrong and our parents said to us, "What do you think I should do about this?" Obviously, we want mercy, but we knew we were in trouble as well. By asking this question to the Pharisees, Jesus was inviting them to speak judgment on themselves. What do we think God should do? Keep sending people to be killed? No. Something needs to change. What should Gordon Ramsay have said to Vic? Looks good to me. Free tequila for everyone. No, of course not. Something needs to change. We want God to be merciful and to be just. So, as we consider the places where we have loved God's gift more than God, what do we think God should do about it? How might God challenge us in these areas? There was a point in that Kitchen Nightmares episode where Vic realized that he was the problem. The truth is, it wasn't his business. He was given all the resources and decision-making power he needed to make the restaurant successful. Once he realized and confessed that his sense of entitlement and poor management decisions caused harm to his staff and the owners, he was ready to turn the restaurant around. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of the fact that he was just a manager. I believe Jesus' indictment on the religious leaders was intended to point out this reality. God loved Israel too much to simply let the screw-ups continue. Jesus knew that they would have to acknowledge the injustice, just like we might imagine how the cops would come crashing down on us if we did that to our landlords. But God hadn't done that. Yet. God had been far more tolerant, far more patient, but it hadn't led to a change. If anything, it made them more bold. But for the sake of Israel, God could not let their leaders have their way. Because like Vic, they were leading people to destruction. God would remove the religious leaders and give leadership of Israel to others because they've ignored God's warnings. They were too blind to see that what they had was from God. After a few weeks of feeling really stuck and enslaved to my finances, I had a breakthrough moment. And that moment came through other High Rockers. Over the past few months, many High Rockers sent gifts and visited my family with home-cooked meals to support our parenting efforts. And you need to know that we live in an area that's pretty inconvenient to visit. So experiencing the ways you've sacrificed your money, your time, and your energy to serve us was an incredible reminder that this was God's vision for God's people. You decided to share the gifts you received from God, and we got to share that joy together. I had forgotten that my finances were God's gift to me. When I convinced myself that it was all mine, I ended up just putting a tighter grip on it and withholding them just for myself. But there was no joy in that. If anything, it just caused more anxiety. Friends, you worked hard to develop your skills, but God gave you those abilities. You toiled for your business and assets, but God provided the means for you to do so. You poured the time and energy into your community, but God brought you all together. We are not owners. We are just managers. God prepared and gave these gifts, so enjoy them. But also recognize that we are just managers of these gifts. God does not want us to hold an ever-tightening grip on those gifts and withhold them for ourselves. Jesus wants us to share those gifts with others in love, so that as we bless others, we share in His joy. After realizing that they were the wicked farmers, the religious leaders eventually arrested and killed Jesus. What a shame. They could have responded with repentance. Instead, they responded with rebellion. Rejecting God's beloved resulted in their own removal from God's beloved people. Within one generation, Israel was conquered and dispersed, and the temple was utterly destroyed. They were willing to kill the son to keep the vineyard for themselves, but it was never theirs to keep, and they lost everything. Friends, we must let this serve as a clear warning sign from Jesus. God holds us accountable for what we do or not do with the gifts God's given us. We're not saved by our works, but we will give a personal account to God one day. Will we recognize that our resources and relationships are God's gifts and manage them to bless others and bring joy to God? Or will we hold on to them tightly deceived by the notion that they are ours and resist God's intentions and instructions for them. During this Lenten season, might God be bringing to mind something you have held too tightly? Perhaps there's an invitation to consider why you are holding it tightly. Like me with my finances, are you scared of something? Perhaps God might be inviting you to consider letting go for a time so that you might rekindle your love for God over God's gifts. Perhaps it's a gift God has given you that you might need to offer others. And as God prompts you, can you share that prompting with a trusted friend who can check back in with you? When I was a child, I shouted, "Mine, mine, mine," just like the tenant farmers. I thought I had learned my lesson, but I did the same thing with Ethan, shredding another friendship to pieces. I wish I could go back and do things differently. I wish I could go back and say, "Yours, yours, yours," to them and to God. I would love to see how the story would have turned out. When we're tempted to claim things as our own, let's learn to say, "Yours, yours, yours," and see how God shows up in wonderful, healing, and miraculous ways.